Welcome back for part two. I'm Judith Yaffe, or I could say I'm Hala. I sometimes say I'm Phoebe Moore, but I won't do that today, because Phoebe's here. Let me just apprise you of where we are at this point, where you're going to begin now. We've got two presentations. We will end just before 12 o'clock. Same format as the first session. We will have a light lunch for people, so you can go out, get some lunch. We can come back in here then, but we have to clear out of this room by 12:45 because there is a Yemen program at 1 o'clock.
No, we live,
Did I get that right? We leave a quarter to 12?
yes, because the luncheon is at 12.
But it's here. I'm sorry, then I don't know the logistics. Is it here? We will finish before, I said before 12. Quarter to 12 is fine. Right. But they have lunch. Now, do they bring it back in here, or can they go? All right, that's what I said. I always I do whatever she says. I want to get it right. So now we're at the second part, and where'd your folder go? It's here.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't know.
Thanks.
Got it now? This is good. This is, as Hollis said, the rounds up a series of events that she and I have been doing this year, including a conference this summer. We could not get everything into one day, and I hate things that go for 2 days. I get tired. You do too. But we wanted to come back because these are such important issues. I wish we could spend a lot more time, but I will give you advanced warning that we will resume programming in the new fiscal year, so stay tuned. Make sure, at least I have your emails. Melissa, can you stand up in the back there? If you think I don't, Melissa is my research assistant, semi-retired, and she will take your email so that I can get in contact with you for the new series of programs that we are going to start to plan for the next over the next year. Don't look for anything real soon, but we will be alive and well for that time. Now, the issue is now we're going to shift focus a little bit, having had such brilliant presentations on the perceptions from Iraq of the other and Iran of the other, and they were. I thank the presenters very much. Those were excellent. But we need to shift focus now because some of the things that they have been talking about and around are very key to the issue of influence, leverage. I have my own theory, which in part, I think David has helped to support, which is not just that Iran's influence in Iraq is limited and I think beginning to wane. If Iraqis weren't so afraid of Iran, I think we would have a more palpable taste of that.
Well, there are a lot of ifs in there.
Never mind. I was an intelligence analyst. I can use ifs if I want. Well, if so. But I also think that the corollary to this is that Iraq's influence and strength is gaining. It's getting a better hold. You may not see it. We may not see it so well from outside. I'm looking at Eustace. I say this because we've had quite a discussion on what Maliki is up to and what will survive, but I do think it will survive. He is making gains in consolidating power. However, he is doing that, but I think it will survive. They're getting stronger. They'll be able to defend their security. They can't do much about what flies over them for the moment, but they will be able to at some point. And if Iran and the Gulf are paying attention, and I'm sure Iran is, I'm sure the Arabs in the Gulf aren't quite as thoughtful about this. But I think what we can see is that Iraq is there. It is coming back. It is going to be an influence. And I've always thought that now is the time to act on that if you want to try to shape what interests, leverages, whatever, the balance of power, the strategic assessment is going to be in the future. So we have two issues here. One is how the Gulf Arabs, the GCC, look at that, and for that we have the preeminent expert, F. Gregory Gause, University of Vermont. You have his bio. I'm sure most of you are familiar with him. He is a frequent speaker here. He speaks, in my own view, is one of the most cogent thinkers on analyzing security strategies and making it, I think, very clear. So we will hear first from Greg, same format. The other issue that is threaded through much of this is this problem of identification, religious institutions and individuals, and how that plays into shaping both national identity, decision-making, and just a perception of where things are going. And for that, I've called on an old friend, and I think one of the seminal figures on Shia institution and thinking, and that's Roy Motahedeh. I'm sure you've all seen his book, Mantle of the Prophet. It is a required reading for most Middle East exposure, for those getting first exposure to this region and these issues. I also tried to read your book on Mohammed Bakr Sadr, and I failed because I didn't understand the legal depth of it. Very complicated. But we're delighted to have Roy here with us as well. We'll start with Greg. Same format. Hold your questions till they're both finished. And Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Judy. I think that your opinion of me is going to go down after you hear me talk about what I think Iraq is up to. But I'm Greg Gause. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I've spent the coffee break trying to get a job as a taxi driver.
If you knew what NDU was going through, you know that I'm first in line.
But no, not yet. It's a saturated market. I do have to say that this is the high point of my professional career, being here today, because I get to be the opening act for Roy Motahedeh.
Oh my!
So that's a real honor. I think that what we're in the midst of right now, and this is not an original thought, many of you have read it, Mohsen has actually said it, we're in the middle of a new Middle East Cold War, right? That Cold War, I think it's very similar to the Arab Cold War of the 50s and 60s. I tell my students and people who ask me analytically what are the most important things to read to understand international politics of the Middle East today, I say get Patrick Seal's book, The Struggle for Syria, and get Malcolm Kerr's book, The Arab Cold War. You read those two, and you'll pretty much understand the dynamics of what's going on right now. What is that dynamic, and why do I think that the international politics of the region is very similar to that period of the late 40s, 50s, and into the 60s? It's because that this contest for influence is being fought out in the domestic politics of states that are domestically weak. Now, let me be clear about what I mean by that. Right? Take Kuwait. Kuwait is a weak state, right? Iraqis can run it over in 12 hours. It's not a country that can defend itself. It's a country that has to call in outside powers like the United States to provide for its defense. By most international relations definitions, that's a weak state. By my definition, Kuwait is not a weak state. Kuwait is a strong state, right? Kuwait is a strong state because it controls its territory. It has some measure of social cohesion. The government actually governs the society, and it is not easily to penetrate that society if you're an outside power. It's not easy to develop positions of influence within that society if you're an outsider. Right? So Kuwait might be a weak state in international relations terms, but in its domestic politics, Kuwait is a strong state. Right? The new Middle East Cold War, like the old Arab Cold War, is being fought out in the domestic politics of states that are domestically weak, where the state is unable to govern its territory, where there are profound social divisions, be them sectarian, regional, ethnic, you name it, right, that provide avenues through which outside powers can influence the politics of these places. Now, some places in the Middle East have historically been weak, right? Because of elite choices, Lebanon has always been a weak state. It has always been a weak state. Yemen, because of its inability, right, to get enough resources to control its territory, has always been a weak state. And for decades, regional power games have been played out in the politics of Yemen, of Lebanon. And we know about these. We don't have to think. We don't have to rehearse these, right? But in the period of the 70s and 80s and 90s, I would argue, the state in the Arab world became stronger. This was an ugly process. State building is not a pretty thing, right? It's a violent thing. It's a violent process. It's historically been a violent process. It's done by people who are nasty, who you would not want to have at your dinner parties, people who are really quite violent in their politics. But that's the way states get built historically. And that's the way Arab states got built. Hard shells were built around these states. These states, to some extent through oil money, through other extent through war fighting and the building of security forces and the building of armies, became able to fend off, right, the efforts by outsiders to infiltrate and influence them. And so the playing fields of the Arab Cold War, Syria, Iraq, become players in the regional game. And international war, right, becomes a much more important element of what drives the international politics of the Middle East. 67, 73, the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. These are the markers of the way international politics in the Middle East is working in those decades. What we have seen, I would argue, in the last 10 years is a crumbling of those hard shells, right? And those states, right, that had built themselves into, right, authoritarian controllers of their territory have now come into crisis. Now we can talk about why, and we can talk about the fact that, you know, people like me missed that coming with the Arab Spring. You know, I'm very happy to cop to that, right? But this begins really in 2003 when the United States breaks Iraq, right? And Iraq ceases to be a player in the international politics of the Middle East and becomes a playing field. And we've heard quite a bit about that in the first session. I don't think you have to go through it, although I really disagree with David and with Judy that Iraq has transitioned from a playing field to a player. I think Iraq is still a playing field. I think it's going to be a playing field for a while. Right? Palestine, also an area where a proto-state that had been building a typical authoritarian security state under Arafat splits in the 2000s. And then, of course, the Arab Spring. Syria, perhaps Bahrain, perhaps others down the line. Right? Places that had previously been, right, tightly controlled by authoritarian regimes now breaking open and have become playing fields for outside powers to try to advance their interests. Now, understand this. In a situation where you are in a divided society with a weak government and you are fighting for control of that government, and this is Maliki like anybody else, your top priority is not foreign policy. Your top priority is maintaining or gaining power domestically. You will invite foreign powers into your politics in order to advance your agenda, right? These foreign powers do not have to fight their way into these playing fields. They are invited in by the local players who are looking for advantage against each other. This, I think, is where Maliki is now, and I'll give my very brief, even though I'm supposed to be talking about the Gulf, I'll give my very brief take on Maliki because it's so different from what we heard this morning, right? I don't think any political leader wants to be the client of some foreign power, right? Maybe occasionally you get ideological ties that, you know, you want to be the poodle of some outsider. But almost no political leader wants to do that. I don't think Maliki wants to do that. I think in his heart of hearts, Maliki is an Iraqi nationalist. I think in his heart of hearts, Muqtada Sadr is an Iraqi nationalist, right? I think in his heart of hearts, Iyad Alawi is an Iraqi nationalist. I think in their hearts of hearts, lots of the guys who fought America in Anbar and in Baghdad were Iraqi nationalists. But when you're fighting for power, you'll take any kind of help you can get, right? If Maliki privileged Iraqi nationalism over his personal desire to stay in power and keep his party in power, he would have accepted a deputy prime minister role in an Iyad Alawi-led government after the 2010 election. I think Maliki held his nose when he went to Tehran to stay as prime minister, but he did it because his priority was staying as prime minister, not as building up a strong Iraqi nation. Right? First stay in power, and then as long as I'm in power, then we can build up a strong Iraqi nation, which can then play a more active role in foreign policy. We are not there yet in Iraq. Iraq is still a weak state, and it's going to be for a while. So what do we have now that I've given my little spiel here? We talk about the arc of crisis, we talk about the Shia crescent, we talk about all things. That's not the way to understand that. David's absolutely right about that. The way to understand the map of the Middle East right now is the arc of weak states. right? It's Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. Is it going to go down to Bahrain? We don't know. Yemen's the outlier. It always is. But that is the arc that's important. And it's an arc of weakness. It's an arc of domestic weakness in which outside powers are playing games. Now, what is the nature of this game? This is not a game in which conventional or unconventional military power is particularly important. That's the paradox of Israel, and what I call the paradox of Israel and Qatar. Right? Israel is the most powerful country in the Middle East militarily. It really has the only military in the Middle East that's configured for serious offensive operations, cross borders and kill lots of people and break up lots of stuff. Right? It is the best army in the Middle East. I think everybody would agree with that. How much can Israel influence this new Middle Eastern Cold War? Not much. Qatar is influencing it more. Because the Israelis don't have that entree into the domestic politics of these states in which the new Middle East Cold War is being fought out. They tried to play that game in Lebanon. They saw it as a failure. Right? I think that collectively the Israeli security elite decided, we tried to play that game, we failed, this is not our game. Qatar, one of the weakest states in the Middle East by measures of military power, has the wherewithal to play in this game because they have money, they can develop local proxies, they can buy guns, of course you can turn money into guns, and they have propaganda. Right? They can play the information game. Those are the tools through which you play in the new Middle East Cold War. Not conventional military forces. Right? And I said, would Iranian nukes make any difference here? I say no. I don't think they would make one whit of difference. And we can argue about that in questions. Right? And I want to make clear that I'm not saying conventional weapons or unconventional weapons are unimportant in the Middle East. Right? There are plenty of conventional wars, and there might be conventional wars in the future. Right? We certainly know that the first example of this kind of Cold War, the Arab Cold War, ended with a conventional military defeat, Nasser's defeat in 1967, at the hands of Nasser in Syria and Jordan, at the hands of superior Israeli conventional military forces. So I'm not saying conventional military forces are unimportant. I'm just saying they're not useful for playing this game. They're not useful for playing this game, the game that we see being played right now. Right? The players in this game, of course, are Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're also Turkey. The United States is kind of a player. I have this little essay in the back of my head that someday I'm going to sit down and write, maybe, who knows, about why the U.S. really can't play in this game. We think we can, but we can't, frankly. Right? And the playing fields are Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, maybe, to some extent. The Gulf states, Bahrain, we'll see. We'll see. That's a scorecard. Now, right? This didn't begin with the the new Middle East Cold War didn't begin with the Arab Spring. It was just exacerbated by it. And this new Middle East Cold War pre-2011 was a series of Saudi losses and Iranian wins. Right? Saudis lost in Iraq. They backed Alawi. They backed the Anbar Awakening. They backed Alawi again in 2010. Losers. Palestine. They tried to bring Hamas and Fatah together with the Mecca Agreement. Losers. Right? Lebanon. They backed March 14th versus March 8th. They funded 2 electoral victories, helped to fund 2 electoral victories for March 14, and they lost. Right? You can understand, look here, my tongue firmly in my cheek. You can understand why the Saudis are a little hesitant about democracy when they back people who win democratic elections and then they can't rule their societies. Tongue in cheek. Did the Saudis have a win in this Middle East Cold War? They say they did in Yemen with the Houthis, right? I don't think there was much Iranian influence with the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, the Houthis mouth the kind of rhetoric that comes out of the Islamic Republic, but I don't think this was a big Iranian play. I think the Saudis played up the Houthi threat and played up their military attack on the Houthis in 2009 expressly because they wanted to show the rest of the region that they were still in the game and could still win one. It also had something to do with politics in the ruling family and all that. But I think that the strategy of publicizing this, which was very un-Saudi, was to say, hey, we're still in the game, we can still win in our conflict in this new Middle East Cold War with Iran. All right? So what happens now? Right? We just have more playing fields open up as a result of the Arab Spring. And how do the Saudis react, right, to the Arab Spring? Well, defense first. Right? Defense first. Consolidate the home front, and that's spending lots of money, right? $130 billion committed. Much of it spent up front in salary increases and bonuses and unemployment benefits and new hires into the government, into the government bureaucracy. And the Arab Spring has bypassed Saudi Arabia. It's bypassed Saudi Arabia. Yeah, problems in the Shia areas in the eastern province, without a doubt. But compared to other places, the Arab Spring basically bypassed Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis consolidated their home front and then consolidated what they considered to be their major equities. And that's Bahrain. Because Bahrain is both domestic security and regional balance. The Saudis want to preserve monarchy. And their view, their lens for the Arab Spring is this Middle East Cold War with Iran. It's not democracy or non-democracy, right? The Libya thing was a one-off, right? They just hated Gaddafi, and everybody hated Gaddafi, and they were happy to see him go. Right? And I don't actually think the Saudis are that bothered by democracy. Actually, they know there are going to be democratic elections in these places. They know there's going to be some kinds of elections in Syria. They've gotten their head around the fact that you cannot have a regime transition in the Arab world now without some kind of an election. Right? They may not like that. They probably don't like that. But they've gotten their head around that. They understand that. Right? So Bahrain was both a domestic issue and a regional issue. As the social scientists like David say, it was overdetermined that the Saudis were going to go into Bahrain. All right? It was overdetermined. Right? One of the interesting byproducts of the Arab Spring was the rallying of the GCC, the old Qatari Saudi kind of. See, the GCC is not serious when times are not serious. But when times are serious, they come together. And the Arab Spring was a serious time, and the Qataris and the Saudis basically got on the same page. You didn't have this kind of squabbling and rivalry and the Qataris going off on their own as they had been doing in the years before 2011. Basically got them on the same page. The Saudis then moved to support fellow monarchs, most notably Jordan, transfer of funds. This invitation to join the GCC was an off-the-cuff thing. It's never going to happen, much less Jordan, much less Morocco. But rallying and supporting the monarchies, and not a single monarchy has fallen in the Arab Spring. Right? And asserting primacy in Yemen, where the Saudis were the major players in the quote-unquote transition that kind of almost maybe got Ali Abdullah Saleh out of power in Yemen. So they consolidated their home front and their basic equities, right, their core interests. And then they went on the offensive. And the offensive is, as Mohsen said, it's Syria. And we don't have to spend that much time on it. But we should note, right, that the Saudi effort to roll back Iranian influence, the one place where they think they might be able to roll back Iranian influence in the Arab world, right, in Syria, right, they actually have less to give to their allies in Syria than the Iranians have to give to Assad. Because while the Saudis have money, and more money than the Iranians have money and manpower. The Saudis will not be sending their army, they will not be sending, right, the heads of their special forces in to help the Syrians' opposition fight against the Assad regime, the way the Iranian regime has, right? One of the other interesting byproducts here, of course, of the Arab Spring is Turkey's move closer to Saudi Arabia. I don't want to call this an alliance. We tend to overuse that word. But the Turks have moved from kind of equidistance in that Middle East Cold War and actually trying to maintain, through the no problems with neighbors policy, good relations with Iran, have moved much more into a balancing position, it seems to me, and much closer to Saudi Arabia, at least on the Syrian position, right? The happier days for the bilateral relations between Saudi Arabia and Syria, and Turkey and Syria are passed. The only thing that I would mention about where the Saudis might not be all in their confrontation with Iran is oil policy. And now this is, there's not a clear picture here, but I think that the cloudiness is instructive, right? Publicly, the Saudis say, don't worry, EU embargo, we will fill any gaps in the market. We will make sure that the market is well supplied with oil. And in fact, from 2011 to 2012, Saudi production has gone up. But Saudi production has not increased, right, since the embargo took place in the beginning of July. Right? And prices have run up. Right? We've had a run up in prices in this past quarter. Right? The Saudis have basically kept their production relatively stable. Now, why is that? Is it because, in fact, the Saudis don't have the ability to produce more than 10 million barrels a day, even though they say they can produce 12.5? Is it because the Saudis are tied into a higher oil price now, taking on all the fiscal responsibilities that they took on with the Arab Spring, and in fact, they're no longer price doves. They might not be price hawks, but they're not price doves. Maybe they're price owls. I stole that from someone. Jim, who did I steal that from? I might have stolen it from Jim Plack, actually. But they're not the price doves that they're sometimes pictured. I don't think that's been true for 10 years, okay? Is it just the fact that the Saudis are in a position where decision-making is difficult because of the age and infirmity of their major decision makers, and it's just hard for them to make decisions to do things differently? You know, the train chugs along, but if you have to do something really different and focus the attention of major decision makers, that's harder in a system where everybody's old and sick. I don't know. I throw these out as speculations, but it's interesting to note that that one of the biggest things the Saudis could do to stick the knife in the back of the Iranians is produce 1 million more barrels a day, right? And really put the squeeze on the Iranians, who are selling less oil, but let's get the prices down too. That would really squeeze the Iranians. Either they can't or they won't. We'll see. We'll see what September production figures bring. You know, I've heard some rumors that the Saudis have gone up to 10.5 million barrels a day. I see Jim Plack shaking his head. Yes, so that means it's true that the Saudis have gone up. But we'll see what happens. Right? So I was supposed to talk about Iraq, so I'm going to spend 30 seconds talking about Iraq. Iraq is no longer the chief playing field of this Cold War. The Saudis believe they've lost in Iraq. I think they might make another play in a post-Maliki period, or maybe in a post-Abdullah period, because much of this is personal. Right? The king refuses to accept Maliki, refuses to meet him, refuses to have anything to do with him. Right? There was a little false spring before the summit when the Iraqis were trying to make nice to get everybody to come, and the Saudis appointed their Jordanian ambassador, and everyone said, oh, my heavens, a new page has been turned. Nonsense. The Saudis and almost all the other GCC states snubbed Iraq by sending incredibly low, insultingly low delegations to the summit, business as usual. The only exception here was Kuwait. Right? Maliki was in Kuwait. Met the emir. Why they had a translator, I have no idea. Is that
a translator?
And of course, the emir attended the summit. Now, why is Kuwait an exception? I think Shia politics, minority Shia politics in Kuwait is just a much less sensitive issue. I mean, to an enormous extent, the Shia parliamentarians in the last parliament, not the current parliament. Don't get me started on which parliament is, and if you follow Kuwaiti politics, you know that's a big question right now. But the Shia parliamentarians were one of the main supporters of Sheikh Nasser al-Mohammed, the former prime minister. Shia community, large parts of it are very, very close to the ruling elite. It's just not. It's not the 80s in Kuwait, and it's not Bahrain. It's just different. So, and I think the Iraqis put some things on the table as part of that pre-summit effort to get everybody to come and have good attendance. And the Kuwaitis have gotten a couple things out of Iraq, right, as a result of that. So that's the Kuwaiti exception. I want to finish off on sectarianism because it's an incredibly important thing. And here David and I are on the same page. And I'm sorry I've taken too long because Roy Mujahideen is a lot more important than I am, but I'll finish off here.
True. That's true.
It is true. It's absolutely true. That's why I say it. Is this a balance? Is this new Arab Cold War, this new Middle East Cold War? It's not Arab Cold War, it's a Middle East Cold War. Is this new Middle East Cold War a balance of power game or a sectarian game? I think for the top levels, it's a balance of power game. I think it's the Saudis, right, trying to roll back Iranian influence. I don't think it's Sunnis trying to roll back Shia influence, right? Iran is not exclusively dealing with Shia groups. Just ask the Hamas guys, just ask the Fatah guys what they think, right, about what Iran's doing, right? And the Saudis are not dealing exclusively with Sunnis. Iyad Alawi is not a Salafi extremist. He might not be a good, pious Shi'i Muslim, but he is not a Salafi extremist, okay? So why do we see this as Sunni versus Shia? It's because of the heightened sectarianism in these weak states. When the regime has collapsed, when the central government can no longer provide security, where do you run? You run to your community. You run to the place where you think you will be protected, where they will not try to kill you. And in many of these societies, that's your sectarian grouping, right? Sectarianism rises as the power of the state falls. I think you can chart sectarianism in Iraq on those lines. Sectarianism is never absent, but its salience in politics rises as the power of the state falls, right? And thus there is, of course, a natural affinity for Shia to look to Iran for support, and a natural affinity for Sunnis to look to Saudi Arabia for support. Now, the Saudis have deliberately increased the temperature, the sectarian temperature, over Bahrain. Bahrain was a popular rising. It's part of the Arab Spring. It was not a sectarian rising. But the Saudi media worked very, very hard to make it a sectarian rising. And as politics polarized on a sectarian basis in Bahrain, that trope, right, just got transferred to Syria. Right? I don't know Syria as well as I know Bahrain, but I would argue that the rising in Syria was also not a sectarian rising when it happened. But as the fighting has continued, it has become more sectarian. And the Saudi media, the Arab media, basically controlled by Saudi Arabia, and with Al Jazeera on board, because Qatar is on the same page as the Saudis, right, it has been portrayed as a sectarian fight, as it has become increasingly a sectarian fight. Now, this is a dangerous situation for the U.S. I think it's a dangerous situation for Saudi Arabia, too, but I'm not a Saudi. It's dangerous for the U.S. because this kind of polarization on a sectarian basis pushes Arab Shia toward Iran. It just does. Right? Which is not in our interests in the short term, or even the medium term, it seems to me. And it also provides an atmosphere in which Salafi extremism does well. Right? I would argue that Al-Qaeda was headed toward the trash heap of history. And the ideology that Al-Qaeda had represented was headed toward the trash heap of history. And I think that these kinds of civil wars, like in Syria, with this heavy sectarian overlay, gives them a fill-up. So, thanks very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Greg, even though I profoundly disagree with 3 or 4 points.
No, that's all right.
Between our friends, it's not important.
That's all right.
Roy, he needs to switch seats with you.
I got it.
Okay?
I'll stand up. I'll stand up.
I'm going to just get Roy's PowerPoint up here.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've now made Greg Roy's research assistant. This is good.
Thank you.
I said it was the high point of my professional career would be to be Roy Mujahideen's research assistant.
This is forward?
No, that's forward.
That's forward.
Yes, because we read from left to right here.
Okay. Sorry. The lecture is called Dilemmas of Emulation. In this lecture, I concentrate on 2 important changes in the outlook of the leading Shiite religious authorities. Disagreements on matters of belief are vitally important to understand actual and potential tensions among the clergy. I must
Is this
tell-
microphone working?
Can everybody hear?
No, this microphone's not working?
I'm not speaking
There we go. It
Speaking-
just-
Yeah.
directly into it. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Differences of actual and potential tensions, to understand actual and potential tensions among the clergy, and I'm not claiming that everybody follows the clergy.
We're not hearing you in the other room.
Sorry. Disagreements on matters of belief are vitally important to understand actual and potential tensions among the clergy, and I'm not saying that everybody follows the clergy in these countries, and the question of succession to its leadership in both Iraq and Iran. The differences between Eastern Orthodox churches and Catholicism are in general smaller than the differences among a lot of Twelver Shi'is. The first and most important changes in recent Shi'i thought is the permission to divide religious affiliation among authorities. To understand this, I refer to the great Shiite bibliographer, Al-Bozorg Tehrani. He writes his name Tehrani, but I have a problem with, I'm going to say everything in both Persian and Arabic way today. So here is, in fact, a text in Arabic of which I offer a translation, somewhat abridged. The Manual of Practice, Risalatul Amariyah, is a general title for treatises consisting of fatwas which bring together questions which common people need in their daily actions regulated by the divine law, the Sharia. They were composed in abundance in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century of the Hijra. That's comparatively recently. In this century, and he's speaking of the 20th century, the ulama have satisfied the need for them. In the foremost of the ulama to write them is Sayyid Bahrul Ulum. And see if I'm sorry, you didn't have this page in front of you, I'm sorry. Sayyid Bahrul Ulum and Sheikh Murtada al-Ansari, he died in 1864. Given that recent ulama do not allow behavior according to the fatwa of someone who is deceased, these manuals must be renewed. Consequently, these manuals of practice and commentary, and the commentaries upon them, are not a matter of concern after the death of the mufti, which means basically the same thing as mujtahid in Persian, or mujtahid in Arabic, except in the cases in which these manuals are subject to commentary and revision of their questions according to the fatwa of living ulama. Sayyid Bahrul Ulum, you see how early he was, Sayyid Murtada al-Ansari. Now, this passage that I'm reading to you was published in 1951. At that time, the use of manuals of deceased Shi'i literature leaders was indeed, as he said, forbidden. Such leaders, of course, are called marja' taqlid. Marja' taqlid. Or maraja'. I'm sorry, I couldn't put long marks on the PowerPoint. Maraja' taqlid, the reference points for emulation or imitation. The classic Shi'i manual of practice is by Sayyid Muhammad Kazim al-Yazdi, and it's called Al-Urwatul Wuthqa. He died in 1919. He's infamous for his opposition to the first Iranian Revolution. Yazdi presents the traditional point of view, that is, it is not permissible, quote, it is not permissible to turn from one muqallid, or muqallad, I should say, one person imitated, to another such person, unless the latter is more learned. So you cannot change the person you follow in Shiite practice from one great authority to another unless you are convinced that the person is more learned. Sistani wrote a commentary on this. He says, "Not at all. One may even turn from the most learned to another in matters in which one does not understand the differences between the two." In effect, Sistani means that one may have more than one marja, or reference point for emulation. This approach, accepted nowadays by many of the maraja, is known among Shiite jurists as tab'id, or in Persian jurists call it tajazo. These are long-term technical words in Islamic law. It's doing part of something. In other words, taking part of different treatises put out by the learned ulama and using any chapter from any treatise that you prefer. This, of course, has a slight resemblance to what is called talfiq among Sunnis, the cut and paste method of making up the law. The convenience of the cut and paste method, which allows marjas to share authority with other marjas, was first evident in the time of Khomeini, although some relatively early manuals mention the idea. Khomeini was late in issuing his manual of practice, and he was the most concerned that he be followed in his political jurisprudence, rather in such a field as ibadat, that means acts of worship, that includes prayer and many other things. He wanted, above all, to be followed in his famous theory of the guardianship of the jurist, wilayat al-faqih in Arabic, or Velayat al-Faqih in Persian. The cut and paste method is also convenient for Sistani. I think Sistani is accepted by sort of 70% of the Shiites in the world now. Sistani, as the most widely accepted marja of the Shiite world, he is able to share authority with regionally respected marjas. The cut and paste method gives permission also to a dead marja, which is working fairly well for Sheikh Fadlallah of Lebanon, who is of course deceased, yet followed in many elements of his manual still. While I think as far as other areas of the law, the Lebanese follow either Khamenei or Sistani. It is probably a sign, here they are. It is probably a sign of Sistani's willingness to share authority that many of his fatwas are co-signed by the other three maraji, or great highest authorities of Najaf: Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, Bashir al-Najafi, and Muhammad Ishaq Fayyad. Here they all are with Sistani, the four, all of whom are slightly lower, all three of whom are slightly lower in rank than Sistani himself, but nevertheless he likes to have them co-sign many of his fatwas. Yet there are a number of issues in which Sistani agrees with the conservative Yazdi, who died in 1919. How is a marja to be recognized? And this, I think, may seem an esoteric point to you, but it's fairly important. For both men, that is Yazdi and Sistani, the primary way is through Ahlul Khibra, people of experience. Functionally, people of experience means the upper level ulama of the madrasa or Hawza towns such as Qom and Najaf. Clearly, the choice of people of experience is a matter of consensus. a system of, we can call it election if you like, but in a modified way, by the acclamation of the upper clergy, does not allow for the strong hierarchical structure among Shiite clerics that many people claim Shiism produces. We have, as I said, functionally, we have a creation of a hierarchy based on a consensus, which is a fragile thing. There's no formal vote or anything like that. We have here, in Christian terms, many bishops, but no pope. The Shiite system of consensual recognition is important to the financial structure of the clergy, where the marja receives contributions as well as the religious tithe paid by Shiite believers, and then redistributes the money to the clergy. In practice, believers pay their religious tithe to the marja, whom they follow in acts of worship. That's the ibadat that I showed you above. Even if they follow another marja in political or other matters. The extent of their leadership is shown, among other things, by the difference of the payout to the students. Sistani in Najaf, Sistani gives the best stipend to students. Khamenei gives a good stipend because he wants to find followers and court favor with the clergy there. Fayyad, whom I showed you before, Fayyaz, he's called in Persian, who's of Afghan origin, gives only approximately 1/3 of the amount that these other two people give. Hakim gives a meager 1/5 of that amount, and Bashir pays sporadically, if at all. Bashir is, of course, of Indian origin, and now has followers in Pakistan and Muslims in India. The late Lebanese Marja Fadlallah, there we are, accepted the Persian political jurisprudence of Khomeini insofar as he says that all the conditions mentioned for the Mufti-Marja are valid for the holder of the guardianship of the jurist, Wali al-Faqih, except being most learned, which is certainly not considered. This view it was a fairly obvious, end quote. This view was a fairly obvious commendation of the revised Iranian constitution that allowed a less learned person to assume the guardianship of the jurist, as Khamenei did after the death of Khomeini. Many Lebanese Shiites like Khamenei, who has sent extensive monies to his favorite causes in Lebanon, but Fadlallah also takes a position in general matters over which the jurist has control. Quote, that which refers to the preservation of order, hifz an-nizam, on the basis of the balance of life among Muslims and others, exists independently, though their life through which their life as a society is preserved. In putting down the Green movement in Iran and other kinds of things, people, the jurists always evoke this hifz an-nizam business, hifz an-nizam in Persian. So it's the kind of backup thing they have when they just say society is unruly and we want to put it down. Fadlallah further modifies the power of the guardian jurist by saying, quote, there is no harm in having a number of faqihs, that's really marajeh, take care of general matters in more than one Islamic community. That's Muqtada, sorry. I'm not Muqtada. I'm saying Fadlallah. I don't have it here. Islamic region. I thought I had a slide for this, but anyway. It's very interesting. He says, Qutr Islami, and Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr also, who ran Iraq for a while with the consent of the government, and then was destroyed by the government. He also claims to be the national leader, the Iraqi national leader for Shiites, which is a concept unknown in the Middle Ages, needless to say. Here, Fadlallah asks that there be people who are for what is an Islamic region, Qutr Islami. There's Mohammed Sadr, I've just mentioned him. Wali Qutr, oh, finally. This is what they call themselves, National Guardian. Again, as with Sistani, we see an accommodation to national communities. Fadlallah's opinion, I'm sorry, I don't want to get behind here, about the limitation of the guardian jurist coincides with the opinion, as I said, of Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, the father of Muqtada. Returning to Fadlallah, his manual of practice also chips away at the authority of the leading jurist while not sanctioning revolution. Quote, when one knows for certain that the guardian jurist is mistaken, it is not incumbent on the person to obey him in matters that are not connected with public order. This is extremely interesting, something of an innovation. The second great change in the outlook of the Shiite ulama, the Shiite religious authorities, are the differences of these maraja, or sources of emulation, in their attitude toward mystical philosophy called irfan. I don't have a mystical... Well, anyway. I have irfan on a later slide, I'm sorry. The differences in attitude rose to prominence when a fairly junior clerk named Hassan Ramazani, who teaches medieval mystical philosophy of Ibn Arabi, his famous Fusus al-Hikam, in Qom. He went to visit Sistani in Najaf and subsequently published an online summary of his interviews. This summary includes the following statement attributed to Sistani. Some pursue the goal, understood of mystical philosophy, it's the goal of making Najaf ugly and its Hausa, and completely opposed to these disciplines. Before he's mentioned Irfan, which is not the proper thing to do. Irfan, the mystical pursuit of knowledge, is a double-edged sword. Pursue Irfan with proper attention to the divine law, the Sharia, and possess both paths, take both paths. Immediately, within 2 weeks or less, great pressure was put on Sistani to take back this statement. This is in 2011. His Najafi colleague, this Ayatollah Muhammad Ishaq Fayyad, or Fayyaz, at the opening of his advanced class on the principles of jurisprudence, launched a severe attack on Ibn Arabi, calling him a, quote, zindiq, heretic, quote, a man lacking in belief in God. About 2 weeks after Ramazani's publication of this Satan-quoting Sistani, Ayatollah Sayyidan, Irfan, there it is. Okay. Ayatollah Sayyidan. I'm sorry I don't say Ayatollah for every name, but it gets... Ayatollah Sayyidan from Mashhad, which is a shrine town in eastern Iran, sent Sistani a request for a fatwa expressing his opinion on, quote, the author of Fusus, meaning Ibn Arabi. Sistani replied in early December of last year, for my part, in accord with the teaching of belief of the great ulama of the Imamiyya, I do not support the above mentioned method, meaning mystical philosophy. Now, this is. I have no doubt that Ramazani, the first guy, has partly correctly reported this, but this also shows the limitations of the position of Sistani. This exchange is interesting from many points of view. First, we see the continuing importance of a group in Mashhad called Maktab Tafkik. Tafkik means the disassociation. In this context, the disassociation of revealed knowledge. Yeah, it's a long I got. Disassociation of revealed knowledge attained from the Prophet and the Imams from suppositional knowledge, especially philosophy and mysticism. Ayatollah Sayyidan, who requested the fatwa from Sistani, is a well-known member of this group whose roots go back to the 1950s. This group believes that too much philosophy has been mixed into usul al-fiqh, and I skip here a history of that particular subject. Sistani does not want to take sides in a quarrel of the Iranian clergy. Through his son-in-law, Shahristani, who resides in Iran and collects money from Iranians who follow Sistani, he has come to some kind of understanding with Khamenei's people, and even part of this religious tax that people pay to Sistani is passed on to Khamenei. It has often been important for Iranians to recognize a spiritual leader in Najaf, in Iraq. It has also been important that this leader in Iraq be an Iranian, as Sistani is. In other words, but one not directly under the thumb of the authorities in Iran. This is the pattern through most of the 19th century and through most of the 20th century as well. There's in Najaf somebody people recognize who's not under the control of Iran. Sistani was probably chosen by his predecessor, Ayatollah Khoi, partly because he was an Iranian. Yet the Iranian clergy are apprehensive about their future as Sistani's position as marja continues to grow throughout the Arab world, including Iran, where people have often shown their independence of the government by recognizing, as I said, in these past 2 centuries, a spiritual authority of somebody in Iraq, Najaf. The move of Ayatollah Shahrudi to Iraq may be understood in this context. Fayyad and Mohammed Saeed al-Hakim both have... the things I've skipped? Shahrudi, here we are. The move of Ayatollah Shahrudi to Iraq may be understood in this context. Fayyad and Mohammed Saeed al-Hakim both have some chance to succeed Sistani, as they are fairly learned, although ethnically not Iranian. Fayyad, as I said, is an Afghan, and Mohammed Saeed al-Hakim represents himself as an Arab. Of course, his ancestors were Persians, but as many of these people would have, but he represents himself as an Arab. Another person, Shahrudi wants to be considered in this context, but he was only Arab-speaking in his youth, Shahrudi, and he had trouble speaking Persian when he first went to Iran. Then he became the head of the judiciary. One reason that Iraqi officials are terribly unpopular among Iranians. And then with the end of his career, he went back to Iraq, where I think he has a better chance for advancement. But he's very, very much too young. He's in his 60s, which is a spring chicken for an Ayatollah. Someday I'll tell you about my anyway. When I published Mantle of the Prophet, there was a big argument between a lawyer I asked to look at the contract and the first publisher, and it was all about the video rights. And I said, what do the video rights matter? And it turned out that Jane Fonda had published her Diet and Exercise book with the same publisher while keeping the video rights. So someday I can publish a Ayatollah Diet and Exercise book. Anyway, Shahrudi is just incredibly too young to move to the top now, but he may have a long-term chance in Iraq, which I don't think has in Iran. He really was extremely unpopular as the head of the judiciary. Yet I said, yeah. So I think that they're likely to choose somebody who's Iranian, but who has lived long in Najaf, or is Najafi born like Shahrudi. Anyway, in Iran, the succession to Khamenei depends on the degree to which the Pastaran, or Revolutionary Guards, continue to be nearly all-powerful. I mean, there's no question that we've had something like a coup d'etat by the Pastaran in the past few years. Ayatollah Mesbah Yazdi used to be a favored figure by them by exalting the guardianship of the jurist to a nearly cosmically important position. But he's become recently a little bit less so. Another possible candidate is Sadegh Larijani, who I think is also in his 60s, which is impossibly too young. But he's I'm finished. Impossibly young, but very much liked by the Pastaran. At this point, the young mullah politicians of Iraq, Muqtada as-Sadr and Ammar al-Hakim, have to sustain their followers by referring to older, more learned scholars as the people who are Maraj, people for emulation. But both movements seem to be self-sustaining, that is the movement of Muqtada Sadr and Ammar al-Hakim, although, as we saw, Iski is declining in its popularity. The tension between the clergy, the tensions between the clergy are many. And I've just used these illustrations from mystical philosophy to illustrate them. These tensions illustrate the great difficulty in translating leadership based on consensus, which is the case, I think, in Shiite circumstances. In Iran, the surface of toleration among the clergy is very thin. The expulsion or even imprisonment of some clergy has shown that this surface toleration has friable edges. In Iran, it is based as much or more on the fear of a liberal change as in any real solidarity the clergy feel among themselves. Thank you.
Can we get lunch and then come back? No? Okay, continue. Okay, we can have about 10 minutes or so of questions, 15 minutes, and then we can get some lunch. Questions? Raise your hand high because I'm short and I can't see everybody. Any questions? I see a hand wave. You're going to make me stand up, aren't you? We'll start with the person, individual in the back, whoever is in front of him. I can't see who you are. Please identify yourself. No.
Steve Feinberg.
Steve Feinberg, thank you.
Department of State. Question for Professor Gauze. I found your slide interesting on the balance. Is the new Cold War a balance of power, or is it a sectarian struggle? And you had mentioned that Iran doesn't only support Shiites and Saudi Arabia doesn't only support Sunnis. But I would disagree a little bit. It seems like Saudi Arabia, or I very much agree with the Iran part, but on Saudi Arabia it does seem like they primarily and almost exclusively support Sunnis. And so my question is, do you think Saudi Arabia sees this more as a sectarian conflict than a balance of power? And specific to Iraq, Why do you think the Saudis are so against dealing with Maliki? Do you think it's because of balance of power reasons, or is it more of a sectarian or personal problem with Maliki? Thank you.
Right. Well, my answer to the first question is no. And my answer to the second question is that I think it's more personal. Look, there is an affinity between Sunni groups in Saudi and Shia groups in Iran. There's no question about that. I don't know why the Saudis would have poured the money they did into Iyad Alawi. He's not a Salafi. He's not, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that there are plenty of people at the top levels in Saudi Arabia who are more comfortable supporting Salafis. I think that there is quite a bit of disquiet at the top levels in Saudi Arabia about the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not that the Saudis like all the Sunni groups. In fact, I think they're quite nervous about the brothers. Of course, the person who was the most nervous about the brothers is now dead, is Prince Nayef, who publicly and on more than one occasion said that the brothers are the reason for all the problems in the Arab world, including in Saudi Arabia. He blamed Al Qaeda he saw them as an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a bit of blindness, obviously, but one could make a twisted argument to that effect. So I think that I think that the Saudi elites see this as a balance of power game, but they find they're more comfortable with and find more allies in the Sunni community. There's no question about that. And certainly the perception of this from the bottom up is as a sectarian fight. I can't speak for Iran. I don't know anything about Iran. I think in the Arab world, at least the parts of the Arab world I'm aware of, I think that the bottom up understanding of what's going on in the region is a sectarian fight. And I think that leaders are very happy to exploit that feeling in their self-interest. I frankly think that the Saudi leadership would be very happy to go back to the kind of relationship they had with Iran when Rafsanjani and Khatami were in power. Because I think that they're nervous that they're going to lose, right? They think they can win in Syria. But I think that I think that the Saudi elites who make these decisions think they've lost Iraq, and maybe they can come back in the next round in Iraq post Maliki, or if something else happens. But I think they've lost Iraq, and I would say that the unwillingness to receive Maliki is completely personal with the king. I mean, he put Ahmadinejad next to him, right? At that OIC meeting, right? Deliberately went and got him and put him next to him, to show what a polite host he is. But he just won't receive Maliki.
Yeah. The gentleman behind Steve, and then David.
Human Saysan, Voice of America. My question is from Dr. Motahede. What is the position of Ayatollah Sistani on the theory of the guardianship of the jurist, Velayat Faqih, and more broadly speaking, his possible successors on that issue? The reason I'm asking this question is because it has important political ramification.
Yeah, sure. I agree it has important things. In fact, Sistani has defied everybody's attempts to get him to express a clear position on Velayat al-Faqih. He's been masterful at avoiding these things. Khamenei has taken to signing after his name Wali Amr al-Muslimin. It's just incredibly, how to say, out of this world. Chutzpah, yeah.
Is that a Shia expression?
Yeah, that's a Shia expression. It's a guardian of the matter of the Muslims, a guardian of the cause of the Muslims or something. I don't know. But Fayyaz...
Saudi Arabia, they call the king Wali al-Amr, too. It's right. It's the Quranic
Wali
term.
al-Amr?
Yeah,
Okay.
That's the Saudi term for the king.
Wow,
Yeah.
well, okay. And there are two of them, okay. As they say in Persian, khayr sho bebinan. They see the good of it. Anyway, the Fayyaz or Fayyad really believes in Wilayat al-Faqih. Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim has made favorable grunts towards it, but basically the Hakim family in general can't really comprehend the fact that Hakims are not running everything. And I simply don't know the position of Bashir Najafi. I expect Bashir Najafi accepts Wilayat al-Faqih. But Sistani has avoided saying it, which tells me that I think he does not accept it. Of course, their teacher, all of them were taught by Khoi, Abul Qasim al-Khoi, and Khoi was definitely against Wilayat al-Faqih. But it's harder to pin down the students. Yeah.
David?
My question's also for Professor Mujahid. You mentioned a couple of disagreements about beliefs, and you mentioned the extent to which Maraji can share authority or a Muqallid can switch. How those sources are selected or rise in mystical philosophy. And what struck me is this might help us understand, and I've thought about this for a little while, splits within the Sadr movement. And I'm wondering if you could comment on it. So if I could say, from what I understand, after Muhammad Sadr died, so when you talk to Sadr followers now, educated ones, his clerical followers, what they usually say, the ones that still follow him, what they say is before he died, Muhammad Sadiq Sadr said, continue to emulate me after I die on existing things. And you can choose who to emulate on new things. But until some of them say until one of my students becomes a source of emulation, you continue to follow me. Yaqubi was one of his students. And so Fadil and them broke off because they started following him. Other ones broke off later and started following
all of
some
these
millenarian groups.
All of these.
And Al-Hadi was pointed out. And so I'm wondering to what extent can we map which Sadr's groups went to whom based on these three things that you mentioned?
To some extent. Muhammad Sadiq Sadr, who's just called Muhammad Sadr by most Iraqis. Muhammad Sadr is really the origin of all these things. Of course, the Da'wah party looks to him. In a sense, the Dawah Party, if you go to their websites, which are several now, they have a picture of Muhammad Sadr. As you say, the Sadriyun, the followers of Muqtada, look to him, although for a while they look to Qazim al-Ha'ari, who is in Qom, as the leader of the movement, because Sadr said, well, he's a mujtahid, and he can be a clerical leader, but he's turned out not to be interested that much. He's been mildly ill. He's never been interested in moving back to Iraq. So his following has fallen off in the Sadr movement, making a big problem. Actually, the Sadriyun. They follow different people. This has something to do with philosophy and so on and so forth. I mean, a lot of people disapproved in Najaf of Muhammad Sadr's extreme interest in philosophy. There was only one teacher. I mean, the Mohsen al-Hakim and Ayatollah Khoi didn't like philosophy. And there was only one man, officially he taught Usul al-Fiqh, but he was really a philosopher, named Badkubi, or Badkube'i, I don't know, I've seen it both ways, who's taught philosophy secretly, I mean, sort of in his house. And Muhammad Sadr studied with him. And of course, he has Falsafatuna, he has all these books called Our Philosophy, Our This, Our That. And so Muhammad Sadr not only embraced philosophy, but he also was extremely interested in philosophy. He wrote a kind of silly book criticizing Western empiricism, but his books are good, but that's not a particularly good one. And there is differences among his followers about these things. Even there are other movements that point back to Sadr. The rising star in Lebanese Shiism, Hassan Abdus Satr, he's the head of the Al-Mahakim Al-Ja'fariya, I think, the Shiite courts in Lebanon. He's publishing, has at least 12 volumes out of class notes from Mohammed Sadr. Mohammed Sadr, anybody who's activist somehow or another has a genealogy, intellectual genealogy that goes back to him. And philosophy is an important point of difference among them. Yeah.
Hassan Asaki and the really kind of millenarian ones come from that side, the philosophical side?
I don't know enough about them. I know they exist. That's all.
I guess
I don't know.
the question what I would ask, tacked onto that, is what I hear from from Iraqis is that because Shahrudi became such a politicized cleric, that he could not re-enter the house and the religious career, and that most of the families do distinguish in their branches. You have the political side, then you have the
Sure.
The
well, a good example of that is the Larijanis, who one brother is the head of the parliament, Ali Larijani, and then there's this other one who's the favorite mullah, Saadet Larijani, favorite mullah of the Pastaran, the Revolutionary Guards. I mean, they're brothers. Yeah.
Question back here. I think the gentleman here has a question, and then I'll wind up with one final question.
Okay.
Okay, that's it. Yeah. Please.
Thank you, Paulette Lee, communications consultant. I have to confess, I am totally lost in the discussion of the religious aspects, but I do thank you both for your presentations. I'm wondering, in both your presentations, what implications are there, if any, for American foreign policy?
Okay.
Thank you.
The question from this gentleman, and his is the. Did you have a question, sir? Yeah.
I actually have two.
Quick.
Very
Make
quick
them short
ones.
and quick.
Dr. Gaz said that he had missed anticipation of the Arab Spring, and I want you to offer your thoughts on why you missed it. And
Well, you can ask him that privately.
Okay. The more important question is the missing element in all this. What would happen if Israel strikes Iran?
It's very short. I have a question, but it's a general question. It almost goes back to the first panel, which is with all this Iranian influence, what have the Iranians in the past week or two, including Soleimani, been doing in Kurdistan? And a bunch of the KDP Kurdish leaders, including Neshirvan, are now going off to Iran. Do you see anything suspicious in that? That would be a question that I would just have left over. Quick responses, gentlemen, and then we'll have lunch.
For Mohsen.
Mohsen has a question?
No. He's better
I didn't say
qualified.
you don't have to answer the last one, but
I'll go
put it
back.
out there.
I'll go backwards. Would I be suspicious about all these Kurds going to Iran? Yes. Why I missed the Arab Spring, I wrote an article about that in Foreign Affairs. I refer you to it. I bare my soul as to why I missed it.
I love that.
Why? The Israelis hitting Iran. Look, I actually think that it would have a very, very strong short-term effect on oil prices, on violence between Lebanon and Israel, on attacks on American interests in the Gulf and in Afghanistan. Long-term, I don't think it changes a darn thing. I don't think it changes a darn thing, right? The Iranians start rebuilding whatever the Israelis hit. This Middle East Cold War continues. I don't think that the brief upsurge of street support for Iran in the wake of an Israeli strike, or an American strike for that matter, will be long-lasting. I think we'll go back to the fights, the domestic fights in these places that we see today. U.S. foreign policy, that's a whole other panel, of course, but my short answer is that the United States has been way too involved in the Middle East for the last 10 years. And we need to go back to a more hands-off position. I'm not talking about an isolationist position, but I'm talking about a position where we were in the 1990s. We were, I think our policy was a little too militarized in the 1990s, a little too driven by the Pentagon. But we didn't rest our position on the internal politics of these states. We are profoundly unable to affect that. Even when we had 160,000 troops in Iraq, we couldn't direct the domestic politics of Iraq the way we wanted. I think that that's a game we are not good at playing, and we shouldn't try to play. That means that we're going to have to stand back and take some stuff that we don't like. But, you know, that's what the Arab Spring is about. We're taking stuff from Egypt that we don't like. There's nothing we can do about it. There's absolutely no way that any democratic Arab country is ever going to have a special relationship with the United States, at least not in my lifetime, and after that I don't care what happens. To the extent that more democratic states move to, we see more democratic states in the Arab world, it will be more difficult for America to get its way. But my bottom line is we don't have to worry that much about it, because our core interests in the Middle East, right, about the flow of oil, right, and avoiding any one Middle Eastern power dominating the region, whether it's Saddam because we didn't like him or the Iranians because we don't like them or whatever. I think the dynamics of the region itself will prevent that.
I want to say,
Thank you, Greg.
Can I say something? I'll be very brief. I think that an attack on Iran would cause a nationalist reaction which would prolong the life of this unpopular regime. And I'm very much against it, whether it's done by the United States or because it would abort the political process in Iran. I really feel that very strongly. Iranian nationalism is quite a strong thing. I won't say the other thing. Okay. Okay.
That's it?